And congratulations to you. We are looking forward to having a wonderful discussion with you here today. After we introduce ourselves and you introduce yourselves, please make sure that you introduce the star of this whole situation, and that is your teachers and coaches. My name is Tom Tinder, and I am an attorney from Charleston, West Virginia.
I'm Steve Franzik. I am a retired professor of political science in the U.S. Naval Academy.
I'm Diana Owen. I'm a professor of political science at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, judges, and good afternoon. We are Reno High's Unit 6. I'm Mia Tolles, and I'll be attending the University of California, Davis.
I am Brock Clark, and I will be attending the University of Nevada.
I'm Ariane Landers, and I'll be attending Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Our unit coach is Mr. Denny Martindale, and our teacher is Mr. Richard Clark.
Okay, and today we're going to do question number 2, and let me read that very quickly for you. President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, quote, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist," close quote. Do you agree or disagree, and why? And what disagreements did the founders have about a standing army, and are they relevant today? And to what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence? You may begin.
Catch-22 is a paradoxical nature, defined as a dilemma or difficult circumstance from which there is no escape because of mutually conflicting or dependent conditions. This panel agrees with Eisenhower's assertion of misplaced power, and that the Catch-22 paradox is a perfect illustration of the influence of the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is an informal alliance between a nation's military and the defense industry which supplies it, attempting to marshal political support for increased military spending. The military receives the necessary tools for furthering political interests abroad, while defense companies become the recipients of lucrative multi-billion-dollar deals.
James Madison at the Constitutional Convention said, "A standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty." In Federalist 46, Madison feared a federal military would become too large and oppress state militias rather than defend America against other nations. As a check to the federal military, the states established their own militias through the Second Amendment, known today as the National Guard. The preamble to the Constitution says to provide for the common defense. This captures the essence of military affairs and cautions against purchasing defense at the expense of national unity, domestic tranquility, and the general welfare. Additionally, the founders had a clear conception of war.
It had a beginning, to be formally declared by both houses of Congress, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11.
A middle, to be executed by the President as Commander-in-Chief, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, and funded by Congress, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1.
And an end, where international treaties are supreme law, Article 6, Section 2. War was undertaken only as a matter of necessity.
The founders feared prolonged conflict and the installment of permanent military bases. However, the War of 1812 proved state militias were not enough to defend our nation. Having a standing army has played a crucial role in our international influence, but when too much power is placed in the hands of the defense industry, there are dangerous consequences. In 2011, the US got involved in the Syrian civil war by aiding Syrian rebels for humanitarian efforts. Despite good intentions, some view the US involvement in Syria as misplaced power. The military suppression of ISIS has led to over 400,000 deaths and the world's largest refugee crisis, exemplifying the Catch-22 paradox.
The US wars in the Middle East have cost American taxpayers $6.4 trillion over 2 decades. Power and money are misplaced in foreign conflicts when it could be supporting the general welfare of the United States, such as healthcare, climate change, and infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave the United States a D+ for its infrastructure. Since the United States is $2 trillion shy of the needed funds for repairs over the next 10 years, a 28% cut to Pentagon funding from the total $717 billion budget would cover the difference.
In 2020, the budget authority of the Department of Defense was $721.5 billion, nearly 3 times the spending of China. Keeping this foreign influence comes at a significant cost. However, Congress has continually funded the military with the power vested in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12. When an international military presence is justified, it can be extremely beneficial to the United States. Through the Marshall Plan, the military was able to contain Soviet influence and restore the economies of Western Europe and Japan.
However, conflicts such as the Vietnam War, the War on Terror, and the international war on drugs have been very costly and in some ways unproductive. Defense spending is a catch-22. The United States must keep a strong hold on its foreign influence and interests, but it must be done effectively to not waste American dollars and lives. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said, "A country that demands moral perfection in its foreign policy will achieve neither perfection nor security. The military-industrial complex is subjective to the paradoxical necessity of war, if the ends justify the means." Thank you.
Thank you. Our immediate past president had an American first policy, and it appears that President Biden has more of an international policy. Which do you think is best, and how can it be achieved?
So we can see with the former presidency that former President Trump pushed the militarization of the police force very heavily during his administration. We can see that over $100 million goes into militarization of the police force every single year, which has since been retracted during Biden's administration. As we can see that the Democrat senator from Hawaii, Brian Schatz, has tried to pull back on former President Trump's policies on militarizing and putting militarized grade guns into the police force. And this has been seen as a huge advantage because we're starting to pull back on that military spending and putting it into more useful things like infrastructure or COVID efforts.
And going off of what my colleague said, COVID efforts has been a problem that very much needs to be tackled on a global scale and not just in America. We can see that on an international level, we have just barely reached 1 billion vaccinations worldwide. However, 87% of these vaccinations have been in first world and wealthy countries. If we continue to only focus on getting vaccinations out to these first world countries and ignoring countries such as India and China that do not have the same medical infrastructure as us, the COVID-19 pandemic and the problems that come with it will continue to persist.
Additionally, one of the best solutions would be to take a little bit of power out of the hands of the president. In Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, it lists that the president is commander-in-chief of the military. However, his powers are not strictly outlined, but we can see through the War Powers Consultation Act of 2014 that we should shift to having a little bit more collaboration between Congress and the president when it comes to declaring war.
Let me ask a question in the broader sense of Unit 6, and that is that legislation in a number of states has been proposed that would strengthen the electoral laws. Do you think that's a good idea? And why do you think we're having that discussion at this point in time?
So I think that we're seeing a lot of this legislation on electoral law because we can see a lot of anti-protester laws and bills coming up, especially in the South. And we've also seen that through the National Defense Act of 1916, the president can call in the National Guard in a state of emergency, or just in our cases in the past year to suppress an insurrection of sorts. Using the military to suppress the First Amendment has been used a lot, especially lately.
Additionally, within local elections, we can see that there is a huge push to restrict the power that lobbyist groups have and arms companies. As of right now, there is a bill in Massachusetts that are hopefully putting insurance on higher at-risk guns, which is putting those gun lobbyists and companies at higher risk of losing money because these local electoral legislatures are hopefully pulling back on their powers within the arms dealing realm.
I'm going to follow up a little bit on what you said with the National Guard. Under what circumstances, if any, should the National Guard be deployed domestically?
So we can see that the 2007 National Authorization of Defense Act gave more power to the executive to federalize the National Guard to deploy it domestically. This took power away from state governors and gave it to the president if he saw the need to deploy it with any domestic disputes where states have lost power over or control over their state.
We can also see in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 that Congress can call forth the militia to repel invasions and suppress insurrections. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16 that Congress arms and disciplines the militia. And then in Article 4, Section 4, the U.S. guarantees each state protection against invasion and violence.
The National Guard should be deployed domestically when it's protecting the interests of the people. We can see that this happened during Hurricane Sandy after it wiped out a lot of people's homes, that the National Guard was deployed in order to help with those people and protecting their interests and getting their homes back. Additionally, we can see historically they were deployed with the Little Rock Nine and protecting them against segregationists. We can also see that within our very own state of Nevada, that the National Guard has been deployed to help people receive COVID vaccines.
Relating to our armed forces, what are the advantages and disadvantages of having a draft system?
So one of the disadvantages that we can see with having a draft system is that without a volunteer army, a lot of the time, as long as the draft continues, it can lose American moral support. We can see that this happened during the Vietnam War with the draft, is that the reason that the authorized use of military force by Congress was so turned against by the American public is because as we continue to draft people, there was less of a moral push for our invasion into Vietnam and protecting our economic interests there at the cost of American lives.
Another disadvantage of having a draft would be it would be extremely costly to the United States. We already have a defense budget of over $700 billion, and over 1/3 of that goes to personnel costs, paying for pensions and healthcare and that sort of things for soldiers and veterans. So if we were to require conscription for all Americans, it would be extremely costly to us.
On the other side, I would argue that Switzerland and Israel have a mandatory enlistment in the military, and we've seen that these countries have an extremely strong rule of law, and their citizens are extremely civically engaged, especially in Switzerland, where some of their citizens go on to lead volunteer projects for a couple years.
Your generation has a relatively low level of voting participation. What can or should we do about that?
So requiring civic education within schools would be absolutely essential to help raise voting efforts. We can see that in 2020, we had the largest election turnout ever in history, both by mail-in voting and in-person voting. And this was partly because of the large education that was coming through social media, which hasn't really been seen within schools. And so as of right now, we can see that there is a bill within the Senate of the Nevada State Legislature to ensure that civic education is being taught through both semesters so that people are having more of an idea of civic engagement and what that means for their future.
Thank you.
You talked about the War Powers Act a little bit and how that kind of sometimes can create a tension between Congress and the president. We've had divided government for a good period of time in recent years. How do you think that has affected the deployment of the military?
Well, we can see that the last time we officially declared a war was World War II. All of our armed conflicts, such as Korea and Vietnam since then, have been authorizations of military force through Congress and then funded through Congress. So there has definitely been a divide between the president and Congress in declaring official military action.
Additionally, we can see through Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12, that every single 2 years, the military budget is reevaluated. So we can see, especially now, President Biden is pushing to end endless wars, and he is further pushing to bring back our troops from Afghanistan by September.
But isn't it true that that evaluation or that report from the armed forces that is due every 2 years or something, that those reports haven't been turned in for decades? Where is the civilian oversight, and what should be done to give us more civilian or congressional oversight of the armed forces?
So we can see that we have not formally declared a war in decades. We've been using the authorized use of military force in Congress, and we're no longer kind of putting forward that time and deliberation as to whether or not we should be engaging in these conflicts.
We can see that during the former administration, there was a large lack of transparency to the general public when it came to what our defense spending was being spent on. We can see that $46 million of taxpayer money was put into 12 different programs in 2019 that were all canceled, and that didn't come out until a year later, which really enraged the general public at the fact that our bloated defense spending isn't being transparent and isn't telling the general public what our taxpayer dollars are going to. However, we can see a shift in this with the current administration, as we can see that Biden has been super open about what his proposed defense budget is and cutting it down by over $17 billion.
Steve?
Okay, do you think the government should require all citizens to register for the Selective Service? Why or why not?
I would argue, no, I don't believe that the government should require all citizens to do so. We can see as we have may I finish my thought?
Sure.
As we can see, we have a huge push towards cyber warfare just with Russian interference within the realms of our federal government agencies. And so with requiring every single citizen to conscript, we are losing the ability to have the best and the brightest when it comes to these hacking proxies and fighting them off.
Good job. Good job. Well done. We have some comments for you now. You got our attention right at the beginning when you come out with Catch 22, a good introduction. And then after getting our attention, you went right through and took care of all the question and the bullet points in the 4-minute presentation. It was well done. I liked you brought in the Second Amendment and the founders' concern, or not concern, but the utilization of the Second Amendment. I had some more questions I wanted to ask for you, particularly when you talked about the Syrian war and misplaced power and all those refugees. That's really the first time we've heard about that. And then great comment. A very important point that at least from states like West Virginia, when you talked about the Society of Civil Engineers giving a D+ for infrastructure, I think we got a D or an F in that. But anyway, that caught my attention, and that's a good point as it relates to what should we, if we reduce the military budget, where should some of the money go? And certainly infrastructure is one area. I must tell you, as a lawyer, for a number of the questions that we were asking you, you were adding on, and as lawyers, we learn that it's always, you have a position or you have the side of the argument that you have, but it's always beneficial. You always have to know the other side of the argument and the other side of the issue. And I thought, boy, it'd be nice if they would just say, this is our position and we're adding on to it, so that we all agree with it. But I want you to know that we also considered the other side, but we took our side rather than the other side. And then you tricked me when I asked you about the draft and you started talking about all the disadvantages of having a draft. Bingo, you turned right around and told me some of the advantages. So kudos to you, job well done, and you're to be commended. You mentioned at the beginning that where you're going to college and so forth. So you're going to continue to just accumulate more education and more knowledge and more understanding and so forth. And you just cannot let what you have learned in school so far, and particularly what you've learned in with the We the People program and how you've demonstrated your knowledge and your leadership so far, you can't let it stop after high school or after college. You must continue, please, to be good citizens, because you're the future of your state, your local community, and our nation. And so congratulations to you. Thank you and best of luck to you.
So much, Judge.
Well, I agree with everything that Tom said. I thought you were particularly strong in terms of your constitutional application. This is a tough question to link to the Constitution, and you did a good job of linking it. I also like the catch-22 reference, although I perhaps would like to have that defined a little bit as you started out, but I think it was a way to catch our attention, which was useful. You did well on the questions that weren't directly related to the main question. I thought that you jumped in on those effectively. You all remember that you're in a kind of a rarefied atmosphere here in terms of being in the national competition, that you are now those informed citizens who have a role to play. If you take a look at history, then most major changes in our society have come about because a small group of informed individuals have organized and moved forward. So now is your chance to think in the future to move forward. So go get them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judge.
I would agree with my colleagues that you had a very strong presentation. I really liked your prepared remarks. I thought that, kind of starting out with the catch-22 paradox and, then defining the military industrial complex. I think you did a good job of doing that. And then closing with it. So you didn't just leave it out there. So the paradox kept coming up at different points in the presentation where it made sense. And I thought that that was a really smart and way to frame your comments. And it added something to it. I have to say, like my colleagues have already mentioned, that your command of the Constitution in terms of the way that it relates to this question and the different aspects of the Constitution that relate to it. We haven't heard anything quite as complete as what you've given today, talking from, a variety of different perspectives on the Constitution, different articles. And the fact that you're again being able to bring it up in relation to the questions. And it was great that you did it within the context of the prepared remarks, but the fact that you had such facility with the constitutional provisions in your answers to our questions, I thought was really quite impressive. One thing I thought that really impressed me also was in your answer to my question about the National Guard. I love the way that you all cooperated in a way that structured the answer in a really neat way. You started off with, kind of looking at the bigger picture and started narrowing it down to the point where, the last person gave all these specific examples. That is a really sophisticated way of addressing a question, to start out with the big issues. And the fact that you shared it across, all of the people on the team in that way showed great teamwork and cooperation. I also really appreciated the way you responded to the election questions. And you somehow tied them into the broader question that we were talking about with the military industrial complex. And I thought that was really also quite well done. So excellent job.